Hello and welcome to How to Take a Coaching Approach to Cultivating a Coaching Culture. My name's Dianna Anderson and I'm the CEO of Cylient, and I created Cylient's comprehensive approach for instilling coaching as a culture in organizations. This is our sole focus and something that we have done with organizations in many different industries around the world. So what I'd like to share with you today are some of the things that I've learned about how to take a coaching approach when it comes to instilling coaching as a way of life in your organization. And I think the quote that really kind of captures the thought is, the medium is the message, in that how we actually do things is what tells people, in this case, what a coaching culture really is, and what coaching itself really is, and how and what they can expect to be different as a result of embracing coaching as a way of life. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about 3 questions that I think are going to help us to understand this better. The first one is, what is a coaching culture? Let's face it, when we talk about coaching, a lot of people see coaching differently. And with coaching cultures, it's the same thing. A lot of people have different interpretations about what that is. So we'll share with you what we think coaching cultures are. And if we're going to take a coaching approach to delivering a coaching culture, well, probably one of the first questions we should take a look at more carefully is, how is it that coaching delivers consistent and sustainable value? Because we're going to be wanting to use those principles, those coaching principles, as we think about how to instill coaching as a way of life in your organization. So let's begin with the first question. What is a coaching culture? Well, that of course begs the question, what's coaching? At Cylient, we define coaching as the translation of insight, right? So an aha experience, into meaningful action, so doing something differently, in order to realize potential. Now, let's take a look at that in parts. Insight. Think for a moment what you experience when you have an insight. You might have that kind of aha of discovering something new and maybe be pretty excited about what you've learned. That really great feeling that accompanies an insight is what happens when your brain rewards you for learning something new. Basically, when you have an insight, you build a new little part of your brain, a synapse, and those neurotransmitters that get released at that time are what motivate you to take action on whatever you learned. By the way, that is the engine that drives coaching. It's that igniting of insight and the motivation that that delivers to go and try something new that is the engine that drives coaching. I would tell you that if there is no insight, there is no coaching. Consider the alternative, which in our traditional leadership styles is just telling people what to do. Consider for a moment that I just give you an assignment. Go and do this. Are you excited about that? Probably not. Neither is anybody else when they get told what to do. So the essence of a coaching culture is really the consistent igniting of insight in a way that gets translated into meaningful action. And the action is equally important with the insight, because if you just have an aha experience but don't do anything with it, you're not going to realize any kind of meaningful results. And so the transition into having people do something new is really an important part of coaching, as is the focus on realizing potential. Notice this doesn't say solve problems. Coaching is most powerful and impactful when we set the bar as using it to help anyone and everyone realize their greatest potential. And when we make coaching a culture, our focus is on realizing the potential of the entire organization. So let's take a look at how coaching gets translated into a culture in an organization. Again, different people have different interpretations of what coaching culture is. At Cylient, we say that a coaching culture exists when there's a shared focus on igniting insight in day-to-day interactions, and that's motivated by the intention to support the realization of individual and collective potential. So what that kind of looks like in day-to-day interactions would be when coaching approaches are integrated into our day-to-day conversations with anybody about anything in a way that enables people to learn with and from each other so that they can discover, grow, and create together. That is the basic engine or function that is at the foundation of a coaching culture. And so when this becomes a way of life, a coaching culture exists. So take a moment and think about your organization. What would people be doing differently, do you think, if that was how people were approaching their day-to-day interactions with each other? If the focus was on igniting insight rather than just telling people what to do? If you think about it, people might be just performing their regular functions, whatever that might be, whether it's customer service or whether it's, being on the line, in a way that would focus on igniting insight rather than being directive. You could also see how coaching could cross boundaries. Maybe people in different parts of the organization need to come together on an idea in order to move it forward. If they take a coaching approach to that interaction, instead of explaining, one person explaining they think they're right and they think the other person's wrong, there could be a much more strong focus on exploring how other people see situations and using the insights that are gained from that to build shared connections. That's the kind of power that you can harness when coaching becomes a way of life. It also, by the way, is the way that we need to address complexity. Because as our world becomes increasingly complex, more and more we need to learn with and from each other in order to be able to innovate new ways of thinking about things and doing things. So if the world that you live in is becoming increasingly complicated, you really need a coaching culture to give people the skills that they need in order to be able to address that complexity much more successfully. So let's step back for a moment and go, okay, so where are we now? Where are you in your culture? And where are you looking to go by instilling a coaching culture? And if you're like most organizations that we've encountered, right now you have a traditional approach to leadership that is some expression or form of telling people what to do and correcting them when you think they're wrong. We have taken coaching around the world, and we have yet to discover an organization that wasn't really using that traditional approach to leadership in some way as the foundation of their current approach to leadership. Now, if you juxtapose that with what we're talking about when we're talking about building a coaching culture, where people are focused on learning together, where there's this igniting of insight, where there is trying things out and going and learning from them again, that is a huge change, really a huge, huge change. And I think it's important for us not to lose sight of that when we start to think about how are we going to invite the organization to move into a coaching culture. And one question you've got to ask yourself is, what if we use these old leadership approaches of telling people what to do and correcting them when they're wrong as our approach for instilling coaching as a leadership style? What would that tell people? Well, I think it would tell people pretty loud and clear that nothing has changed. And as a result, they don't need to bother changing either. So let's step back and ask ourselves, what is it that makes coaching work? And how could we use those principles of coaching to instill coaching in our organization so that the medium that we are choosing is actually the message that we really want to send about what coaching cultures are and how they add value? So the place to begin for us is to step back and look at coaching itself and ask, how does coaching deliver consistent, sustainable value? And that's the question that my co-author and I asked when we wrote Coaching That Counts way back in 2005. And this was really actually when coaching was really flourishing and people were asking, what kind of value does coaching actually deliver? And so in order to write the book, we stepped back and looked at some of the most comprehensive ROI data that had been gathered at that time and asked ourselves, what is it that makes coaching work and how does it add value? And I'm going to draw from those insights as well as my 25 years of coaching, actually almost 25 years of coaching, to tell you a little bit about first what I believe and what I have seen work in terms of ensuring that coaching adds value consistently. And then we're going to talk about how to translate those coaching principles into an approach for instilling coaching as a culture. So let's take a look at our 5 principles for successful coaching engagements. And again, the reason we want to do this is to understand what those are, because in some ways you can think about instilling a coaching culture a little bit like a great big enterprise-wide coaching engagement. And so we want to understand what makes coaching engagements work so that we can use those principles as we set a path forward for ourselves to instill coaching as a way of life in the organization. So the first principle is to harness the person's inner motivation to change. I'll tell you, that was one of the things I learned very quickly as a coach, is that you can't just tell somebody to change. You actually have to somehow invite them to change in a way that motivates them to want to do things differently. And the thing to keep in mind is that people are motivated to attain the things that matter most to them, not to you, to them. And so one of the things that we'll talk about is, as you're planning how to create a culture of coaching, what's the story you want to tell people about the value that they will derive and the organization will derive from instilling coaching as a way of life? And then our second principle is consistently igniting insights that foster learning. Again, going back to our definition of coaching is that translation of insight into meaningful action. It's that igniting of insight and then moving it into action that drives the motivation to change. And so one of the questions we've got to ask ourselves is, how are we going to ensure that that becomes a way of life in the organization? It has a lot to do with the approach to coaching that you choose to use as the foundation of your coaching culture. So we'll talk more about that in just a minute. And then our third principle is building skills in order to ensure sustainability. And what's really important here is, like the building of any kind of skills, there's foundational skills and then there's more complex skills. And you want to make sure that as you're thinking about how to instill coaching, that you're getting the foundational skills down and really well reinforced before you build into more complex outcomes. Our fourth principle is iterative practice to consolidate learning. So in a coaching engagement, the client is always being invited to take an idea that happens in the coaching engagement, go out, practice it, try it, see what works, discover what they could do differently, come back, have that conversation with the coach, and then go back and try it again. Well, we want that kind of iterative learning to also be one of the foundational parts of a coaching culture. So we're going to talk about, how do you get that to be a way of life? And then lastly, we need an ongoing glide path for learning and evolution. So really solid coaching engagements don't end when the coaching engagement ends. The coaching engagement is simply kind of a glide path to continued learning and growth and evolution. And so we want to make sure in the planning for instilling a coaching culture that that is part of the conversation as well. So let's talk about how we're going to use these coaching principles and scale them in order to create a coaching culture. So again, our first one is what's going to motivate your organization to embrace a coaching culture. Again, we talked about what a huge change this is. And so the question becomes, what's the story? I mean, how do you want to share what a coaching culture is and how it's going to add value for your organization in a way that makes people or helps people understand why it's going to be worth the effort for them personally, as well as for the organization. And it's really important to remember that everybody is motivated by slightly different things. So you want to make sure that how you express the value of a coaching culture for your organization captures the imagination of everyone in the organization so that they can personally see what they're going to be doing differently and envision how that's going to be valuable to them. Because they need to believe that the journey is worthwhile in order to choose to take it. And they need to feel that they're part of the story, that they're not being talked at, that they're being talked with, and that the story includes who they are and the contributions they can make. So how will you create your story, and how will you tell it in a way that people feel that they are part of what is being created here? And let's always speak in real terms, using real value and talking about what change really could look like. So rather than using broad generalizations, encouraging people to tell their stories, give real examples of things that people are doing differently that delivered real value that people have would find worthwhile to attain. And then how are you going to continue to tell that story over time? You know, when it comes to a coaching engagement, we don't just have a big introduction and go, hey, here's how you're going to gain value from coaching, and then never come back to that through the coaching engagement. You know, that story is the touchstone that is always being built upon, touched upon as the coaching engagement unfolds. And so the question becomes, you know, how will you continue to keep that story alive as the coaching engagement, as your coaching culture engagement unfolds, so that people are learning from the stories that are being told and momentum is being built for change. So our second principle is really about igniting insight in day-to-day conversations. And again, the thing before you begin to invest in building a coaching culture, and it truly is an investment on many different levels, not only in terms of, you know, the money that you invest, but the time that it takes, the energy that it takes for people to go through this significant transition is considerable. And so it's really important before you make that investment that you look at the approach to coaching that you're going to use as the foundation of your coaching culture and ensure that it is based on igniting insight. And here's why that really matters. There are a lot of coaching cultures, or excuse me, coaching approaches out there that really are just what we would call sort of a traditional approach to leadership that just got translated into questions. So it's kind of like what we call problem solving with questions. So coaching approaches that rely on consistently just asking the same questions in order to resolve an issue feel really comfortable to people, mostly because they're actually not that different from what they're doing right now. The igniting of insight, that aha experience that enables people to learn in the moment, is a very, very different way of leading and a very, very different way of being in conversation with people. And so there are lots of different approaches out there in the world. Make sure that you're pressure testing to make sure that the approach that you're using consistently ignites insight, and also that the values that you want to instill in your coaching culture are represented in that approach to coaching. The thing I like to say is you can't plant one kind of seed and expect something different to grow. So the seed that you're going to plant, that is the foundation of your coaching culture, is the approach to coaching that you choose. And so it's really important that you ask yourself some really pointed questions about whatever you're going to choose before you invest in making that the foundation of the culture. So other things to think about: are people going to remember it? If it's not practical, if it's not something that people will easily remember, the likelihood of them actually choosing to use it is going to be significantly lower. The other thing to ask yourself is it something that can be used everywhere, all the time, with anyone? A coaching approach that's, say, only useful when you're having developmental conversations probably isn't going to translate well into a way of life, because it's going to be focused on much more complex conversations than you're going to have in the moment. So it's just important to take a look at what the intention is behind the model that you're choosing and really ask yourself, does this have the kind of practicality and flexibility to truly become a way of life for us? I think the last thing to keep in mind is, will it become a shared language? Coaching is in many ways like a language. And when one coaching language is used across your entire enterprise, not only do you get the value of in the moment coaching happening, but you also wire up this ability to have coaching conversations across any boundary or any barrier. So people in different divisions or in different countries or in different teams could approach each other and be speaking the same coaching language, and in that way use that approach as a shared way of resolving the kinds of more complex challenges that cross boundaries and barriers that I think we're finding increasingly difficult to resolve using our traditional approaches to leadership, where we're constantly arguing about who's got the right answer. So again, really you want to spend some time on choosing a coaching approach or model that's going to have these kinds of qualities. At Cylient, our approach is called Untying the Knot, and it is an approach that we have found works globally, and it works at all areas of the enterprise, mostly because it's such a simple yet comprehensive way of looking at the challenges that people encounter. So our next principle is, what skills do you need to build first to ensure a sustainable culture of coaching? And this really comes into play, when you're thinking about what are the first skills that you're going to lay down for the culture, for everybody, to establish a culture of coaching. And I think there's some huge messages that are sent in how we approach this. So at Cylient, we believe that coaching cultures are founded on in-the-moment coaching and feedback. And there's two key reasons why we think that's really important. One is that sends the message to everybody that coaching is for everybody and is also the responsibility of everybody, not a select few. So one concern I personally have when I see coaching cultures being instilled by teaching a select number of people to become full-fledged coaches is, one, that's a really, really complicated set of skills to actually be able to run full-fledged coaching engagements. And I feel it also sends the message that coaching is actually only for a few people who are given the privilege of learning those skills, and not really the responsibility of everybody else. And so I think you just have to ask if that's the message you want to send as you look at how to build a coaching culture. The other reason I think that in the moment coaching is really important and more effective as a foundation for a coaching culture is that everyone in the organization can learn these skills. And so in that way, it becomes a way of life, because everyone can feel confident in their ability to take a coaching approach to day-to-day conversations. And that's a platform that can be built upon in many, many different ways and given many different expressions in terms of how coaching becomes more evolved in your organization. So it's just something to think about in terms of when you're choosing how you're going to approach instilling skills in the organization. What's the message that you want to send, and how will you ensure that the skills that you're building build upon each other? The other thing to think about, often people say, well, where should we begin? And I always say, work with the willing, rather than starting with the people who are least likely to embrace or value coaching, seek out the team or the division or the group, or the country that is really going to have value for coaching and coaching-based leadership, and work with them. And then really help them deepen their skills. So really help them become great ambassadors for coaching through a lot of practice. By the way, it takes a lot of practice to become fluent in coaching. I would say it takes as much work and practice to learn how to coach as it would to learn how to drive a car, or learn a new sport or a new art form, because there's so much rewiring that you've got to do in your brain in terms of what leadership is, how you interact with other people, just a lot of new skills to learn. And so I think a really essential thing to be giving consideration to as you look at how to build a culture of coaching is, what's the network of reinforcement that you're going to put in place so that you can hold people in the learning long enough for them to really embed coaching in their DNA. That's why at Cylient, we've actually created this entire system that holds people in the learning, because that's what it takes to wire up coaching as a leadership style. And be sure that the first folks that you're putting through are going to be great supporters or champions of coaching, because you want to be recruiting people to support and help you bring this effort forward at every step of the game. Again, another good reason to work with the willing, because they're usually willing to be great supporters as they gain their skills. Another key principle is learning from our experiences. Again, this is a hallmark of coaching. One of the reasons that people learn so quickly in coaching engagements is they use their coach as a place to get inspired to try something different. They go out, they try it, they come back and share what they learned, and there's reflection upon what went well and what could be done differently. And then the client, if you will, is encouraged to go out and try again. And it is through this iterative process of learning that skills are built, confidence is built, and in many ways, change actually becomes something that people can deal with much more quickly and easily, because people gain the confidence that they can go out, try things, and learn from it. And again, instilling coaching as a leadership style and a way of life is a really complex undertaking. So it's really important that your organization be comfortable with the idea that they're not going to be perfect. And they're not just going to go to a workshop and walk out and be able to use these skills consistently. And so one of the things to think about as you're setting up, your initiatives to instill coaching as a leadership style is, how are you going to reinforce the necessity of iterative learning and make it okay not to be perfect? And there's different ways you can do this. I really love it if you've got, some of those people that maybe were your early adopters, if they're willing to share their stories of not only what went well, but also times they stumbled or times they did something and it wasn't as perfect as they hoped, to make it okay for people to feel like they can learn in the moment and not be punished from it or by it or for it, which is, something that we see often with our traditional approaches to leadership. And by the way, this goes for the folks who are running the initiative to instill coaching as a leadership style as well. What I'll tell you is that every single coaching culture engagement will be somewhat unique and have its own unique challenges according to the culture that you are moving from, what people believe is true about leadership. I mean, there's just all kinds of challenges, what we would call knots, that you're going to encounter as you invite people to make this transition. And it's really, really important as part of the coaching engagement or the coaching culture engagement that you find ways to gain insight into what's going well with the overall program and where you could do things differently. And please don't descend into pointing fingers or trying to figure out who caused the problem. That's not a coaching, excuse me, that's not a coaching approach to dealing with change. What we want to do is actually take a coaching approach when things don't go as planned. See if we can gain insight from what we've learned and adjust and go back and try it again. The last thing we want to look at, excuse me, the last thing we want to look at is how we will ingrain this change in the culture. Again, a really successful coaching engagement doesn't end when the coaching relationship ends. It's really just the beginning of continued learning. And so one of the questions is, as your culture begins to get traction and people gain skills, what will you need to do to ensure that that becomes part of the fabric of your organization? And I think there's a few things to think about. One is just, how are you going to reward coaching behaviors? If people take the risk to embrace coaching as a leadership style, what are you going to be able to do? Or what would you have people focus on that would reward people for taking those risks and embracing that way of life? Also, are you going to recruit and select for coaching-based leaders? We send a lot of messages by the people that we hire and also the people that we promote. And if you want coaching to be a way of life, it'll be really important that the people who really exhibit those skills and role model that form of leadership are the people that are rewarded for that, and the people that we hold up as being role models for others. And lastly, how can you use coaching to collectively explore how to take your coaching culture to the next level? So again, you want to be engaging people in the process of coaching by using coaching to make change of any kind happen in the organization. And so the more that you can partner the learning of coaching skills with the deepening of those skills and also the deepening of change in the organization, the more resilient your coaching culture will become and the more benefit you will be able to gain from it. So I'd love to answer any questions that you might have about coaching or how to instill a coaching culture in your organization. If you're curious about this, please feel free to reach us at Cylient, and we would be happy to be in a coaching conversation with you about what coaching cultures are all about and how you might be able to get started building one in your organization. Please feel free to reach out to us at any time. Thank you again. It's Dianna Anderson, CEO of Cylient. Would love to talk with you.